Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's BOMA San Francisco educational webinar, AI-driven real estate, capital capacity, and competitive advantage. We're glad to have you with us this morning. And before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes. We'll have time for Q&A throughout the presentation. We encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature, which you can access by pressing the More button at the bottom of the screen with the three dots. And in the middle row to the far right, you will see the Q&A feature. Feel free to input your question at any point in time, and our moderators this morning, Maurice Callis and Sophia Pagan, will gladly ask the questions throughout the presentation, as well as we will ask questions at the end, answer questions at the end, excuse me. Please note that the chat feature is currently closed, and we will not be using it today. With that, I will hand it off to Maurice for a quick introduction about today's topic.
Hello, BOMA friends and family. Thank you, Randy, for the introduction, and thank you, BOMA SF, for hosting this webinar. Like it was said, Sophia from Performance Properties, and I'm Maurice from Bay Area Stone will be your moderators. We'll be the ones that will be asking the questions as you put through the Q&A. It is my pleasure to introduce Mark Fischer, our presenter. Mark has over 30 years of experience in commercial real estate and is the proud member of BOMA. He is the founder and CEO of Inspire Commercial Real Estate Services, where he advises owners, investors, and organizations on improving real estate performances, operations, and portfolio strategies. Thank you, Mark, for presenting, and I will give the floor to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Maurice. Hello, BOMA San Francisco. Great to be with you today. We're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and think about things from maybe an asset management perspective, and talk about how the market is changing and how we as vendors and property managers and asset managers can think about real estate very differently in light of the watershed changes that are occurring across the marketplace around the world. Well, first, let's talk a little bit about some of the national trends and the AI renaissance that's occurring, particularly in your marketplace. And I think what's one of the first things to kind of get out in the very beginning is that what's happening in the San Francisco Bay Area in terms of AI and in terms of the ability to refill vacant office space That is not occurring anywhere else across the country at the same level of scale. So I think what's really nice to, you're kind of living through the middle of some of these things. Those things aren't happening outside of your marketplace at the same level that they are. So we'll kind of dissect a little bit of that. One of the things that's really interesting is that, you say the very familiar term is, location, location, location. What is the most important thing? What are the three most important things in real estate? It's usually been location based. And today, there is an emerging need to change from a technological standpoint to focus on power, pipe, meaning the fiber optic connection that's available to a location, and the platform. What will the physical building support? That's a gigantic change. And I think as we go through this, we're going to talk about how some buildings are in a great position to capitalize on that. Some buildings are not. And many asset managers are having to make a decision about what kind of tenants they go after because the needs are so diametrically different. Just a couple of statistics. Thinking about your economy in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has more than 60% of all the global funding for AI comes into the Bay Area, and more than 75% of US funding. Almost a little bit more than half of all the venture capital funding related to AI is being targeted to your area. This is unprecedented. And there are not many places that could say this about anything. There's not 60% of global money going to a single area for anything, not just AI, but anything else. This is really unprecedented. So it puts San Francisco and the surrounding communities in a unique position to react and respond to these gigantic market shifts that are occurring. The other thing that sets you apart is the physical presence. So the fact of the matter is there's more than 800 company headquarters that are based in your area. There are more than 800 AI startups in the area. And the physical presence of these companies in the Bay Area is helping to stabilize the market there in a way that the rest of the country is not experiencing. On top of that, most of the AI, I guess I would say not most of the AI jobs in total, but 13% of all the AI jobs in the area are based in the Bay Area. So across the country, it's not the majority of the jobs, but there aren't other places where 13% of the jobs are concentrated. So the people are there. And as a result, the fact is that the market environment is changing dramatically in the Bay Area, where it's not necessarily the case around the country. The reality is, we've still got lots of vacancies, and I am about an hour west of Baltimore, an hour north of DC. I've been in commercial real estate for almost 35 years. The market in DC for office space, the vacancy rate is about 22 to 24% for Class A office space. And I have never seen that. That is twice what it's been historically over time. And it's going to probably end up getting worse. And when you start talking about Class B space, it's going to be it's a slugfest to try to find tenants to go into Class B buildings. The fact of the matter is, the idea that you've got the physical presence and you've got the talent in the same place. And because we're going to talk about latency, we're going to talk about the need to be connected in a way that requires on-site operations, that changes everything. So where many locations are seeing their office market destroyed right now, the Bay Area is an entirely different spot. So the fact is, we like the work, we like the remote work, and we've had an experience with that, but there is a need for people to be back in a physical office in a lot of the AI property or AI companies that are out there. And as a result, the office market's changing dramatically on the West Coast compared to the rest of the country. So you're in an unbelievable place to capitalize on this opportunity. And we're going to talk through some of the ways that you can do that, and then talk through some specific ways that managers and vendors can use AI to help them run their business. You could say that Wall Street is kind of the ground zero center of the financial world. DC's the center of government. Hollywood's the center of filmmaking. The Bay Area is the center of AI by far. And in your case, AI is helping drive the office sector recovery in a way that you're not seeing anywhere else around the country. The other thing that happens is that we're moving away from looking at this as space to looking at the buildings as infrastructure. What does the building have in terms of power, in terms of pipe, in terms of the ability to support the floor loads? What does the building have that makes it unique to be ready for that? And I think that's one of the big conundrums that asset managers are facing. It's a relatively easy decision to upgrade your building in the Bay Area. It's not so easy when you're talking about buildings across the country. So think about the traditional tenant. We have focused for most of my career on it started with tenant retention, and then it was tenant experience. We've talked a lot about putting amenities into buildings and really focusing on creating a unique experience, and those things drove retention. There are still lots and lots of entities that still want that. So the law firm, the financial firm, the professional services firm, there are lots of places, lots of companies that are going to be driven by those things. But then there's another switch where you're going to have tenants that are looking for the technology. The amenities, the tenant experience is less important. In those technology first buildings, those are going to prioritize things like electrical services, HVAC, the data connections to the building. In those cases, things like amenities, like a foosball table or a conference facility or ping pong tables in the lobby, those things lose out. Having a tenant experience with a whole lot of tenant experience feel-good activities, those things are losing out because those technology-first companies are focusing specifically on the infrastructure. And then there's going to be a few tenants that want both. They want the amenities, but they also want the tech infrastructure. And I think this is a really important slide because it illustrates for an asset manager where the conundrum comes in. If you've got a building that's traditional, amenity rich, and you've got tenants that want that, that's awesome. Do you want to make the investment in making your building a technology first building? Who are you going after? And does your tenant want just the amenities, just the technology, or both? You're going to have to make a decision. And just again, think about it from the standpoint of what does the future look like? What does 10 years down the road, what does that look like? Will those tenants that are looking for those amenities and tenant experience, will they in 10 years be technology first, regardless of whether they want to today or not? So are you losing something by not investing in the technology today because you'll be 10 years behind your competitor across the street who made the investment? Or are you in a smarter position not to go in that direction because your tenants are not wanting that now and they don't want that 10 years from now? The million-dollar question is, what do you do with your infrastructure and how much do you invest in this? And again, I think the calculus is different in San Francisco versus the calculus anywhere else across the country. The rules by which you make these decisions are going to be different, but the asset manager has to think about these things. One of the challenges the asset management teams have with technology forward tenants is that they need to scale quickly. A lot of times these will be startups. So these will be a company that takes a couple thousand square feet and then needs 10,000 feet and then needs 100,000 feet and then needs 500,000 feet. How do you make that work? How do you allow that tenant to scale? And one part of the scale is the people side. So going from 1,000 to 5,000 to 10,000 feet. But how do you scale the technology too? If you allow them to use your building for the technology component, how do you get a tenant in place and not let them grow so fast that they outstrip your power capacity or outstrip your HVAC capacity or outstrip the roof capacity to have HVAC equipment there. The opportunity here is that you have to be ready for these tenants to need to scale and give them the flexibility to do that. But you also have to protect yourself because you may have vacant spaces in the building that you're looking to fill. If you let that AI tenant scale too quickly, they may take resources that are going to prevent you from leasing the rest of the building to other tenants. And the other, kind of what we said is it's less about the number of square feet for people. It's less about the rent per square foot. It's more about the ability for the building to accommodate growth of power, HVAC, and floor load. Most of the tech forward tenants are looking for 3 to 4 times more power use at the building. So does your building have 20 to 30 watts per square foot? Most buildings do not. So there's got to be some sort of power upgrade into the property. Where this has worked here on the East Coast, we have industrial properties that maybe were manufacturing that had big power to them already. Those are great places to think about data centers, or great places to think about tech forward tenants, because the power is already there. It used to be a steel mill or a big manufacturing facility. It's located in a place where the ground is relatively inexpensive to purchase, but the power's there. That makes a big difference. The next aspect that they're looking for is dark fiber, which means fiber optics that have never been used. So there's nothing else on it. They get clean fiber from point to point. That allows them to have the least amount of latency, the fastest connection from one location to another. That fiber connection is super critical, and there are only certain places or corridors where that tends to exist. It's extremely expensive to install it if the tenant needs to put it in themselves. So they're looking to be close to the corridors where the fiber is already existing. And then the floor loads can be 5 times, 10 times more than the normal floor load for an office. Been around for a long time, and it used to be a law firm would want to have a formal library, and it would be so incredibly heavy with all the books stacked in such a small space. We would routinely have to reinforce the floor underneath of the library because of the floor loads. That's gone away with technology, and many law firms have gotten rid of the law library. But now we're looking at the possibility that you may have to put in significant structural improvements in your building to manage the floor load of some of the equipment that we're talking about. That, again, that can be really expensive. And, if you've got a building that's relatively full, you're putting a tenant on the 11th floor and the 10th floor is full, it's going to really be a lot of disruption to try to put structural steel and reinforcements on the floor below, because you're going to impact that tenant in a great way. And, as you continue, you want to put a tenant on the 12th floor now. Well, the 11th floor is going to get impacted. Do you spend the money up front and put reinforcement in the building as you redevelop it? Do you put it in as you develop the building from scratch? Or do you wait to identify the tenant who's going to tell you where you need to put it? Those are all asset management questions that depend on what the asset manager strategy is. Because you could just as easily put that infrastructure in place and the space doesn't get used for that purpose, and you've now put a bunch of money into a building that doesn't need that floor load capacity any longer. From the owner's standpoint, there's also a bunch of risk. And again, this is kind of thinking about it from the level of an asset manager. What is an asset manager focused on? The first is that there's a commitment risk. You're bringing in tenants that are often going to be either venture capital backed or very small with the potential for exponential growth. That means that this company could be the next ChatGPT, could be the next it could be the next pick the name of your company and stick it in there. It could be the next winner, or it could go bust in 6 months. So from a landlord's perspective, if I'm going to bring in an established company that has been around for 50 years, I have less risk there than I would by bringing in a startup, but I have more upside potential with the startup. So how does the owner manage those risks? The first thing we look at is higher security deposits. We're going to require much more than just a month or two of rent. The second is that, let's say that this is a startup that's its own LLC or corporation, but it's backed by venture capital or backed by a larger parent, the owner should be requesting a guarantee where if the tenant goes belly up, the partner, the parent company, the venture capitalist needs to pay that lease out. Sometimes they also do prepaid rent tranches, which means that you may pay the first 2 years up front, and then in 18 months, you pay the next 2 years up front. So they have it set up that the rent gets paid in advance so that there's not this monthly having to get a monthly rent check to make sure the tenant is still viable. The next big thing too is power. The rent is tied to the power allocation. And we've gone away from the idea of we're just charging you per square foot. Now we're charging you by your power use. So we have to be more sophisticated in terms of how we measure, but we also have to be thoughtful about how we distribute the power among all of the tenants. It's one thing to let a tenant take all the power they want. Hey, as long as we're capturing it, as long as we're billing it to them, that's fine. The problem with it is that high use tenant can take more power than their pro rata share of the building, which then would leave other tenants without that ability. So we have to be really thoughtful about what that looks like. And when you talk about expansion, we have to think about the same thing. If the tenant doubles in size and the power consumption doubles in size, what does that do to the rest of the ability to lease the rest of the building? That's really the challenge. So we've got to think about power in a very different way. And that's where these things like the infrastructure riders come in. So, hey, no matter what, you get a maximum number of watts per square foot. No matter what, you get so many thermal, you get so much thermal load that we can reject. So you get so many BTUs that we can reject. When your equipment goes above and beyond that, the building doesn't support that any longer. So we're actually going to throttle back the HVAC and give you only the cooling that you've been allocated. Things like cooling redundancy, is that a landlord expense or is that a tenant expense? That's a question. So does the landlord have to put in 2 times or 3 times cooling redundancy? In a traditional model, the answer is no. But in today's model, maybe the answer is yes, if that's the kind of tenant that you're trying to attract, especially if you're expecting to have multiple tenants in your building that all have that same requirement. It would be crazy to think of 10 tenants in your building have to put their own multiple redundancy cooling into the building. So for that standpoint, we think about that in terms of having to regulate that up front. In many cases, that landlord is probably going to install cooling, generator capacity, battery banks, other things to help with the requirements. Is that a landlord expense? Is that tenant expense? It's going to certainly be wrapped up in the rent for sure. It's certainly going to be charged through as an operating expense. So the rent is going to be larger on those buildings. The operating expense pass-throughs are going to be much larger. The landlord has to be able to recover the cost of those things. And then in terms of expansion, this is another thing that the property manager and asset manager have to be prepared for, is that there is usually going to be a right of first refusal. The tenant's going to want a right of first refusal. If you're going to lease the remainder of my floor, I want the right of first refusal to take that space, because if that company is growing, they need to have that. This may not be the kind of tenant that you want to put in your building that's 90% occupied. You may want to be strategic and say, no, I've got a 90% occupied building. It's very stable. I can't accommodate this expansion. On the other hand, we've got a couple of landlords that I work with in a consulting practice who say, we've got 50 buildings in the marketplace. If I outgrow this building and I can't accommodate them at this building, we tear up that lease and we move that to a building across the street and we put them in that building. And as they grow out of that, we tear up the lease and move them to the next one. So they look at it not in terms of the building and the ability to grow out of the building, but they say, we want you to grow within our organization. We want to be your landlord for the rest of your experience. And we're going to move you from building to building and accommodate your expansion that way. That's an asset management strategy. So next, let's talk about some more of the risk valuation strategy things that the asset managers are thinking about. They have to make a decision about whether they're going to choose those traditional amenity-rich tenants, whether they're going to go out for technology-forward tenants, or whether they're looking for that unicorn, that tenant that needs both things. I think unless you are in a very specific area, maybe the Bay Area would be one. I don't think many asset managers are going to go after option three. I think what we're going to see is people are going to either continue doing what they're doing, looking for those tenant experience tenants, or they're going to make the decision to invest in technology to improve their options to locate more tenants. But it's going to be probably the two options on the left and the middle are going to be the more prone for most asset managers. When you're dealing with tenants who are these technology forward tenants, one of the important things to ask is to kind of understand where they are in terms of their AI model. If they're in the training mode, so they're a brand new startup, they're doing a specific AI model that works directly for commercial real estate in some capacity, then likely they're in a training mode where the AI needs to be trained to do the work. That's very different than an inference model where they're already training, the training's already occurred, and now they can be what we would call edge computing. They can be closer to the users rather than being closer to the data center. And in that case, that's a different tenant. That's a different tenant need. It's a different requirement. So understanding that will tell you what their technology needs are going to be. The inference model is not going to be in the data center. It's going to be close to it, but not in it. In those cases, what we really need to focus on is latency and the ability to get power or to get data back and forth from the data center to the company's location in a really, really small window. And we've talked about some of these already. We've talked about the power gap. We've talked about the floor loads. And the thermal loads are spectacular. When I started in the business, we didn't really have data centers. It was totally different experience. But even in the beginning, the data centers were all air cooled. And there is a cooling corridor behind the back of each of the server racks. And you just put air conditioning through that corridor and it removed the heat. Today, the equipment generates way more heat than what can be accommodated that way. So we've moved away from air cooling to a liquid cooling, direct to chip cooling. This gives you lots more ability to reject heat. But now we're talking about water. Now we're talking about cooling towers. We're talking about much more complicated equipment and much, much larger thermal loads. So this is a big deal. And we talked about the concept of latency, but right now, 3 milliseconds is the latency gap. And we want to be within 3 milliseconds in terms of the data capacity that we can send and receive. That's incredibly fast. And, this is not going to be, we're not going to see these groups that are going to be too incredibly far away from those fiber optic channels or the fiber optic pathways. There are going to be certain areas of the country that are lit in a way that makes that work. On the East Coast, we have a pipeline that goes through Northern Virginia and Western Maryland and up into Western Pennsylvania. So there's a really good core of dark fiber in that area. And as a result, we're starting to see more data centers. We're starting to see more technology clients in that area. But that's because of the capacity and the closeness and proximity to those think about it as a super highway for data. So that comes back. This is really the question the landlord needs to ask, and that is, do you want to go after the traditional tenants, or do you want to invest the capital to attract these tech-forward tenants? I'm going to say, for most of the country, the answer is pretty straightforward. The answer is, I want the traditional tenant. In certain markets that are tech-forward, some in Northern Virginia, some in Texas, some in California, those are going to be the ones that are going to probably invest in capital earlier than others. Here's a couple of things for asset managers, a couple of challenges for asset managers. And This, if you decided today that you wanted to convert your building to support these tech forward requirements, you cannot snap your fingers and have this done. In most cases, there's a power desert issue, which means that it's going to take 4 to 6 years for the utility to be able to upgrade the power on your building, which is why, as an investor, you're looking for those places that already have the power there. You're looking for that former, we have a location here in the Baltimore area that was a former manufacturing site for General Motors. It has become a really great location for data centers because the large power is already on that site. So what became the plant closed, they scraped the site back down. Where that became incredibly valuable is that could have really just been industrial warehouse space, but it became valuable for data center because the power was there already. And think about it from this standpoint. From a power desert, if I need to wait 4 to 6 years for that power upgrade, I'm locked out of the game for a half of a decade. So if I buy that former industrial location and I turn that into a data center, there's nobody around me who's going to be able to compete with me for the next 5 years or so until the utility company can put power on that site. And I'm sure you've seen the videos. I'm sure you've seen the social media about generators. You can most certainly put tons and tons of generators on site, but they create a noise level. They create environmental issues. If we're talking about even natural gas generators, they're going to be relatively better for the environment than a diesel generator. But the last thing you want is 100 generators running, spouting diesel fuel into the air on a hot summer day. It just doesn't work. And there's a big not in my backyard group of people who've assembled against data centers and generator capacity and those kind of things. So the challenge is power, and the challenge is going to be floor heights and floor capacity. And you've got an older building that's closer to where you need to be. Maybe you abandon every other floor and you use that vacant space as a way to run HVAC or a way to run technology. Maybe you remove every other floor. There's ways around it, but a lot of times the older building can't accommodate the cooling and the power. So it's not necessarily really easy to transition an existing building to support these tech forward tenants, but you have to be creative with it. Again, in this marketplace, Class B property is really struggling. That Class B owner may go, hey, I'm never, ever going to put tenants back in here again. Maybe my solution is to go after those tech forward tenants. And look, if I abandon every other floor and fill the rest of the building with high tech tenants, maybe that's a win, and maybe it works in that environment. Some of the other opportunities, which are really kind of interesting, and I want you to think about this in terms of AI, but I also want you to think about this in terms of just regular real estate once these technologies come into play. The first issue is the idea of on-site generation. We know that we have a grid that's not going to support this technology expansion. We've got to do something with the grid. That's going to take decades. So the idea of generating power on site is important. And the things that are becoming popular are fuel cells, which use oxygen and nitrogen and different kinds of gases to create fuel. There's the ability to do microgrids. And you're seeing it in California. I'm not necessarily seeing it across the country, but the idea of battery storage as a way of working with capacity. We still don't have the economics here in the rest of the country to make that work. We don't have the subsidies, and we don't pay the cost per kilowatt hour that you do in California. So the batteries and things like that are taking off there. They're not necessarily across the country. What's also really kind of fascinating is the idea of a small module nuclear reactor. And this company in the picture is a company that provides that. Could there be a use case in 5 or 10 years that we could power a building off of a nuclear generator? Could we power a building off of a fuel cell? Could we use battery storage in a much larger capacity? The answer to that is absolutely. I think what's really interesting is it may be that the data centers are driving this on-site generation technology, and that technology will be better and cheaper in the future. That may make sense for us to use that in our commercial buildings, even if we're not looking for those high energy demand tenants. Another thing we said, one of the downsides here is we've got lots and lots of heat generation. So we're not able to cool these things via traditional air-cooled data center capacity. Now we're having to cool it with water. What do we do with that heat? Can we do something with that heat? I don't have great examples in the US, but I have some great examples in Europe where companies are taking that heat from these data centers. They're putting it into what we would call district heat. So in the city of Baltimore and downtown DC, a lot of older cities have chilled water and hot water supply or steam supply that runs under the streets. If you've ever been to New York City and you see the steam coming out of the grates, that's their underground distribution of what we call district heat and district cooling. In theory, right now, those places are running heat generators, so big boilers, and they're pumping steam through the pipes underground to get to the buildings that use that district heat. You could turn off those boilers and just use the heat generated from the data centers to put into that environment and move that heat through the city. So that's an option. You could heat greenhouses. There's another example in Europe where they're using it to heat an indoor swimming pool or indoor pool complex adjacent to the data center. So there's some really creative ways that you can move that heat to a different place and use it. But even in that case, unless you're talking about district heat, you're still going to generate way more heat than any of those other uses are going to potentially be able to use. And the other idea that's kind of neat too is we're talking about these edge computing centers. So the computing centers that are located close to the data center, but they're located elsewhere. What you see in the picture is a modular data center. So rather than having to construct data centers, this allows you to bring it in almost on, kind of a back of a truck, plug it in at the building. If you want to expand, you plug another one in. You want to expand, you plug another one in. So rather than building a data center from scratch, the modular data centers allow you to plug and play. What's nice about that is if that tenant now relocates to another building or relocates to a different floor, you just pick up and move the modular data center to another location and continue operating. It's not like we're installing the data centers from years past where they were dedicated spaces. Now the modular allows us to put them anywhere. And that means you could turn vacant storage space in the basement. It could be that you turn maybe some areas of the parking lot or parking garage or places where it would not normally be rent producing. You could turn that into a place for these modular data centers. So that's a really cool option as you look at the opportunity to grow this within your portfolio. I'm going to pause here just for a second and see what kind of questions you might have before we keep on going. I don't have any questions in the Q&A, but any questions this far through?
Just a reminder for everyone as well that the Q&A is open through the duration of the call.
All right, so let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about property managers and vendors. How can you use AI? The first thing I want to say is that AI is here, and I think that it would be in all of our best interest to really embrace it and to think about where the best use case is. If you have the opportunity to do webinars, to do training courses, anything you can do to understand AI and to think about how it could be used in your business is a step in the right direction. I also would say that there's so much out there and it's changing so rapidly that rather than jump in and just start throwing AI all over the place, evaluate where it makes the most sense. I would call it the low-hanging fruit. Where is the opportunity to employ AI that's going to give you low risk and high return? One of the easiest areas is in terms of predictive maintenance. So predictive maintenance meaning that we're going to measure building systems and we're going to determine when to maintain them based upon things that the systems tell us. Think about replacing your HVAC filters. If you replace filters every 3 months, you're potentially taking a filter out that still has useful life in it and you're throwing it away. Predictive maintenance says, I'm going to measure the air impedance from one side to the other side of the filter. As the filter gets dirty, it's going to take more push to push the air through the filter. The predictive maintenance will say, okay, once we hit this particular threshold, we're going to send a work ticket to the engineer and we're going to ask them to change the filters on the 3rd floor, which means that you could change the filters throughout your building on totally different time frames based on the point where they're at the right time of the cycle for them to need to be replaced. Predictive maintenance is a fantastic way to use AI. Labor reallocation, and a lot is said about getting rid of people, and AI is going to replace people. Maybe for some of the things that are, I would call it scut work, inputting invoices into an accounting system. That's so easy to automate. What I really think is going to happen is we're going to take the overworked property manager, take the scut work away, and allow the property managers and the team to focus on the things that are high value. Tenant experience, tenant relations, asset manager focus, spec the properties. We're going to allow AI to get the property manager out of the office and into the building and doing the higher value tasks. And right now, property managers I hope you're all using AI for communications. It's certainly a great way to write something, but I think what we're going to continue to see is AI chatbots, the idea that we're going to be able to ask questions. Tenants can ask questions and the AI will respond back. I think we're going to see the continued opportunity to automate communications with AI. And from a building consultant, building enclosure perspective, there's a question about using predictive maintenance for items for the outside. Absolutely, for sure. We will use it to you could have it evaluate the roof without having to necessarily walk on it. AI could be used to determine where the potential is for there to be a seam failure. We can use it on all kinds of different places. And I think there will be an ability to bring in adaptive AI through predictive maintenance on all building systems, not just things that are moving parts. For sure, I think we'll see that. Some other challenges. The fact is we have a lack of interconnectivity. And what you're probably experiencing as a property manager is your HVAC contractors talking about their AI solution, and your janitorial contractors talking about their AI solution, and the elevator contractor has AI, and you've got AI on your building automation system, but none of it talks to each other. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that you have pretty much every vendor out there is telling you about their AI solution. And at the end of the day, they don't talk to each other. So we have multiple AI systems all kind of happening at the same time. And, when we're finished with this, is there a value that we've lost by not having them connected? The other thing that's happening is the insurance industry is playing catch up. So think about what happens if AI does something and it actually creates a problem that you haven't anticipated. Will the insurance cover that? And I'll give you an example. What if you're a company and you're using AI as a way of screening candidates who are applying for jobs at your company? And in your mind, AI is going to be the perfect screen because there's no bias. AI is just going to evaluate what's information that's on there. But remember that it's a learning model. That learning model could learn bias and could interject bias into their evaluation. Well, how is that covered under your insurance? Have you thought about what the implications are? If you go back to movies in the past where the computer takes over the space station or the computer takes over the war games, we could be at a point where the things we're trying to get out of the system by using AI could put those things back in it again, and insurance is not there yet. And think about functional obsolescence. The things that AI needs today are not going to be the things it needs a decade from now. So we have to be thoughtful about that. The landlord that invests millions of dollars to get their building ready for tech-forward tenants has to continue and invest money because that infrastructure is going to be no longer valid a decade from now. So you've got to really stay on top of things in a way that we haven't needed to do this before.
Mark, I have an anonymous question. If you could give one piece of advice for owners trying to attract AI tenants, what would it be?
That is a great question. I think we have talked about how to we've talked about how to set the building up. I think it's really a matter of preparing the building ahead of time to getting thinking about things like the infrastructure, thinking about things like cooling capacity. You've got to think about these things. What we don't want is for an AI tenant to walk in the door to a traditional office building and do a lease deal with an asset manager who doesn't understand what this means. So for example, if you go in and do that deal and the tenant ultimately has not gotten throttled for their electrical use or their HVAC use or the other things we talked about, that landlord could shoot themselves in the foot and have a long-term lease that they have to administer, but they didn't think about those things. And now they've got a tenant that's taking more than what their pro rata share is, and it impacts the rest of the tenants. I think the issue is, even for a person that's not thinking about it, is to start knowing about this and being really thoughtful about it. I think there's going to be attorneys. I think there's going to be MEP contractors who are going to be experts in this area that will help you revise leases and things. I think we'll lean heavily on the attorneys that are in your marketplace because they're in the throes of this stuff. I think the worst case scenario would be an owner does a deal with an AI tenant thinking that they're cutting edge and not realizing all the other things that go with it. Let's talk for a second about, from a vendor standpoint, how can vendors use AI? I think architects, engineers, and construction, there's so much opportunity there. The idea with all of this is not just to use AI just because it's a buzzword, it's because what people are doing. The idea is that we're going to work smarter and we're going to add value. So think about architects and engineers. The architect and engineer is going to be able to use AI to help design things faster. If you've not seen it, this is really cool. There are a couple of AI solutions that will do space plans for brokers. And I see it on TikTok quite a bit. So this would be a really good option for you to look at. You could put in what the program is. So we need 3 conference rooms, we need 10 offices, and AI will plot that onto your space plan and give the tenant an idea of what that could look like in 30 seconds. So there's so many cool things that are happening on that side. Security and access control, AI can help there. Janitorial service, think about demand-based cleaning. We talked about proactive maintenance, and we talked about only replacing the filters when they need to get replaced. Well, what if we only did cleaning in the areas that needed to get cleaned? What if AI told us when an area was dirty and we didn't necessarily have to go through and clean areas that were already clean? Think about building engineering, demand-based cleaning. We'll turn that into demand-based maintenance. If you've got a row of 10 sinks, can you all agree that those sinks don't get used at the same intervals? The sinks closest to the door get used more than the ones that are farthest away. What if AI could tell the building engineer when it was time to do proactive maintenance on those sinks based on the actual use? And instead of going through the building and doing PM on all of those sinks once a year, they went to the sinks that needed them when they needed it. Those are the kind of things where AI is going to add value for sure. And I think it's worth a conversation about, how do you how do you how do you really implement this? It's not about headcount. I think one of the best values here is we can get the property managers to do what the highest and best use is. I do a lot of expert witness work. Most of in so many cases, the property manager didn't tour the property, didn't inspect after the snowfall. The property manager didn't do things. If we can get them out of the office where they're not doing the mundane things and get them focused on the things that add value, that's a benefit. If we could improve operational efficiency, that's a gigantic benefit because we drive down operating costs and utility use. And then from a risk management standpoint, AI could be incredibly important there. AI could be saying, we know what the temperatures are, we know what they're going to be tonight, automatically generate a ticket to send an ice crew around to check for ice after that snowfall. AI could be used to evaluate the cameras, determine what the situation is, evaluate the road conditions, the sidewalk conditions. AI can be used to determine whether we need additional services or not. I think it's going to be a game changer in terms of risk management. It's going to look for the places where there's a potential problem and alert the manager so that we can stop it before it gets started.
Mark, there is another question. Is there a difference between this wave in demand for AI compared to the last tech boom?
Oh, I think it certainly is. I think that I think this is growing much more rapidly. I think that unlike the last tech boom, this is also requiring way more power, way more cooling capacity. It's requiring more infrastructure than the last tech boom did. And it's doing it at a time where, looking across the platform, energy use has increased at home and at work across the board. Now we're going to increase that by another factor to add this technology. We didn't necessarily have that the last time. So I think it's going to be totally different.
We have another question from Tim. Predictive and conditional-based maintenance has been around in the industry. How do you see AI offering different value than existing solutions?
That's a great question. So the idea, what we talked about with predictive and other kinds of proactive maintenance, it has been that the computer can measure something and give you an alert about that. That's kind of a, when this happens, do this thing. So you've got to kind of program it that way. I think AI takes it to a different level, and AI will help us to refine that so that we don't have just that one choice. It could be that AI is now looking at that HVAC filter issue, and it's also saying, okay, well, I'm looking at the amount of material that's getting through that filter. I'm looking at the carbon dioxide levels in the tenant space. I'm deciding what to do with fan speeds. AI may recommend a different type of filter. It may recommend a different fan speed. It may recommend different things to solve a problem, where we've only looked at it from one standpoint or one perspective and only one thing that we've programmed. I think another aspect is something more complicated, like elevators. We're using predictive maintenance in elevators and have been for a long time. We know that when the door opens 1,000,000 times, this particular part fails around 1,000,000 door openings. So we replace it at 900,000 or 950,000 or whatever. We replace it proactively. Those are another place where I think AI is really going to be stepping in. We're going to see that change on a much, much different level.
Paul has a question. He says, how can AI be used to improve building parking operations?
Gosh, there's so many aspects of that. We could use it if you have a security officer or parking attendant that's walking around looking for hang tags. We can use AI to eliminate hang tags altogether. We can use it as a license reader as you come in. We can use it as a recognition of the person coming in, and We can use it for billing. Imagine what it would be like. You've been to the maybe you haven't, but there are places where you can walk into a little like a C-store in a building. You can take whatever you'd like and you walk back out and it charges your card automatically. You could be in a parking situation where we've gone from parking attendant to the parking machines that we pay on the machine to you drive into the parking lot, you drive back out and you get charged for it without having to have any connection to anything. I think we can do it from a risk management standpoint. I think there's a lot that can happen within building parking.
We have one more on the vendor perspective. How is AI changing the way vendors identify and pursue new business opportunities in commercial real estate?
So I think that's a great question. I just did a presentation for BOMA Southwest Conference last week, and I've done a couple of presentations talking about helping vendors connect in and network and use AI differently. And I think this is one of the most important things that you can think about is to help with prospecting. I see it as, first of all, AI, you can use AI to ask about things like portfolio transitions. You can ask for who are the managers of these buildings. I use it for prospecting. So when I went to the Southwest Conference, I wanted to meet certain people. I gave AI a list of the attendees, and I asked them to identify folks that I should be talking to. I asked them to identify anything that we have in common based on the LinkedIn profile and my resume. And I gave it information, and it gave me back stuff that I could use to set those meetings and begin those conversations. I would say that one of the easiest things you could do is use AI as in your prospecting to help you identify who people are. I think you could use it to identify maybe anytime the building changes ownership, you could have it flag and say, hey, this building got sold. For a lot of vendors, when the building sells, that's a great time because the new manager comes in is bidding. That's a great time to kind of break into it. So I think, not only kind of prospecting, but then also researching and being able to come up with an understanding of the pain points that manager's dealing with before they get there, before they had that first meeting. So hey, I understand this is an issue, and here's our solution to help you fix it. It just gives you a level of preparation that I don't think you can get elsewhere. And it does it in a fraction of time, just a few seconds to get ready for an appointment where you could spend the afternoon searching all different kind of places to find information about your prospect.
A great answer. I think we have a few more questions, but we can save them for the final Q&A. So if anybody has any burning inquiries, get them in now. You can also send anonymous.
So we've talked about a bunch of different things. We're getting really close to the end of the presentation, but this is kind of a summary of the things that we talked about. So this would be a great time to open up for questions.
Well, there are some questions on the board. What are the risk of sharing confidential company information with AI platforms?
I still think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, is managing that information flow. I think, in theory, you're putting that information into a LLM like Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, and in theory, it's going out into the world and it's pulling information and giving you back a response. You could say, for example, evaluate all the leases in my building and give me a list of rights of first refusal, rights of first offer, security deposit amounts. You could have it parse information. You could have it create a rent roll for you. In theory, all of that data is now going out into the world. And if I'm across the street from you and I say, put together a rent roll for the building across the street, in theory, the system could put all of that back together again and give me the rent roll for the building across the street. That's a challenge. And I think that's one of the things that we have to deal with. What I'm seeing at least from the expert witness side, is law firms are creating their own LLMs that are internal, that don't go out to the internet. And there's value in that because there's a firewall that prevents information from leaving there, but allows information to come in, and they're using it in a different way. That is, I think, one of the most important pieces. I also think, just talking to people at the Southwest Conference this week, there's still a lot of nervousness out there. I talked to one person who said their company prohibits AI completely. They're locked down. They can't use it. They can't even use Grammarly for spell check. It's locked down. I don't think that's the solution. I don't know that fully wide open is a solution, but I think right now, we kind of talked earlier about how insurance hasn't kept up. I think the IT leadership hasn't kept up. This is still the wild, wild west, and there's so much change happening so quickly. I think companies are struggling with what to do with this. And I think it's also fair to say, I think like academia is struggling what to do with this. Your kids in high school and college are using AI to write papers and to prepare presentations and to do things. The key is, in that case, it's going to be here with us to stay. It's not about getting rid of AI. It's really about finding out how we can make it work. And, confidentiality is going to be one of those things that we have to deal with.
There's another question that was put on the board. How will AI infrastructure growth, especially data centers, water usage, be balanced with sustainability? And do you expect new government regulations to address this climate impact?
That's the $1 million issue. I think the water use is certainly a concern. And, even with an efficient cooling tower, we're going to have water that is evaporating back into the air. So regardless, we're going to put an absolute ton of water through the system, and we're going to reject heat to the outside, and we're going to evaporate water. At the scale that we need that water, it's not like we can pull it out of something and put it back someplace. So, I've had buildings in my career that have used a large pond or a lake to provide cooling. So you bring in that cool lake water, and then you reject water back out into the lake, and the lake becomes your cooling tower. That's awesome, but the buildings aren't generating the amount of heat that the data centers are. So what you'll end up in that situation, if you try to solve the water use problem by using a natural body of water, you're going to be putting so much heat into there that you're going to create another environmental issue in terms of that ecosystem. So I think water use is going to be a gigantic issue. I think power use is going to be a gigantic issue. And, you start talking about putting generators on site. Now we're talking about air quality. I think this is going to be, it's almost like the image of, you got these two trains and you can see the collision happening. And the train collision is going to be between the infrastructure needs of AI and the sustainability impact of AI. And right now, I don't know that we have an answer to either of those. Maybe the economy changes, the market changes, maybe things like nuclear come into play. Maybe we find different ways of cooling, more efficient ways of cooling. The technology, I think people are trying to focus on that because of what the limitations are. But I don't know that there's great answers. I think that government regulations are part of it. I think in my marketplace, where I live in Western Maryland, we're in that data corridor. We're building data centers here. There is an enormous amount of public pushback for exactly the reasons that are suggested here. I think we're going to see this be the big fight over the next decade. And I don't have any great answers for it. I think it is. I think it's going to be very difficult to balance those two things because they are so far apart from each other.
We have one more in the chat, just came in from Tim. What is your impression of tenants' receptiveness to interact with AI chatbot instead of human property manager team from a service and human connection perspective?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm a Gen X, so I will also preface the answer with Gen X. I would much prefer to get a solid answer from a chatbot or a chat than to have to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. And that I think is Gen X. I think it's introversion. I think it is speed. And I can be doing that while I'm doing something else. So I think there's a balance there too. For those nuts and bolts things, boy, it's great to get rid of those little, small, tiny questions and to not have to deal with it. So, I see there being a really great opportunity for the property manager to get rid of those low hanging fruit questions that get asked all the time. Um, I think that's a real benefit. Where I think that AI benefits us is that property manager can then be proactive and spend more time going out to tenants and looking to create a better relationship because they're talking about bigger picture issues and not the small potatoes things. I also think that there's a great opportunity for the AI to bubble up certain questions and answers to the property manager. So the AI can answer the really simple stuff, but when the tenant starts asking about something, the AI can go, hey, I better let the manager know about this line of questioning. You can set the AI up to do that. I think there's going to be an opportunity to integrate this so that the low hanging fruit gets answered very quickly by the bot and the other things automatically populate up to the property manager. And I guess the other thing I would say too with that, Sophia, is if you're a tenant forward tenant, you don't really care about human connection. It doesn't really matter. You're looking just for an answer. If you're that tenant experience kind of tenant, you want that human connectivity. So that I think is going to be a question the property manager, the asset manager have to decide what do they want? How do they want this to work? I will also say, having built websites for my businesses and working with contractors to keep the websites up, putting in an AI bot chat is so incredibly simple. It is really, really easy to do, but making it work really well is challenging. So it's not going to be, the property manager's not going to do this at the property level. This is going to be a company level decision. I think there's room for both pieces.
Oh, I will say the BOMA website now has a chat bot, so we do encourage you guys to use it and ask questions. If you have any issues with it, let us know how it's working for you.
For sure.
Um, We would like to say thank you for everyone who is actually still online because we know we ran a few minutes over, but we do appreciate your patience. Once again, we thank Mark for his time today and providing us with a wealth of knowledge and information. We will be sending a follow-up email with his contact information. Should anyone have any additional questions that they would like to run past him and possibly get an answer or potentially utilize his services, as he does um, teach and speak on a number of topics. He is a BOMA fellow. He has contributed to quite a few of the BOMA international educational products that you guys have seen throughout the years as well. I would also like to thank Maurice and Sophia for being our moderators today and for all of you for joining us. With that, we will say goodbye and we hope to see you at our next event. For you property managers, it will be our BOMA trade show on May 21st. And after that, we will be hosting a new version of Coffee with a Cop on May 26th that we hope to see you all at. With that, we say have a good day and we'll see you soon. Thanks.